Hi everyone, I'm Michael Styson, and this is Mobile Growth Podcast, where we discuss how to launch, grow, and successfully monetize mobile apps. And today our guest is Niels Beenen. He is in charge of strategic partnerships at Singular. Singular is a mobile attribution company with industry-leading cost aggregation, flexible and granular ROI analytics, and huge companies like Lyft, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Rovio, and others use Singular to unify marketing data and get access to granular creative analytics. Hi, Niels. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I guess my first question is, and this is super interesting to most of our listeners, how to actually get accurate attribution data, including in-app revenue. It was somewhat simple before Apple introduced the ATT framework, but now it's a complete mess. So any thoughts on this?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for the invitation. I like being here today. Appreciate the time. I think even before everything that happened in terms of the ATT rollout, there's never been as straightforward as people may think. How you can actually match all of the kind of revenue data on the install level and really calculate what your ROI is. For that, you need two sets of data. You need your upper funnel marketing data. That's your cost data, like how much am I spending on a specific platform, on a specific creative or a keyword or in a country, so to say, and how you then combine that with your install data and your post-install event data, your revenue data or subscription data, IAPs, whatever it is that you look to measure, right? Now, I think what you're saying is true. It's historically, all of this has been linked to an IDFA or the Google Advertising ID. And in terms of iOS, this is only possible now, when you have opted-in users, and that rate hovers about the 25% mark, depending on the country that you're in. Maybe also what kind of way that you look at things, but you can safely say that for the vast majority of iOS users, you will not be able to actually link those events back to the actual IDFA, which makes that type of granularity impossible. Now, on Android, you can still do it. We still have the Google Advertising ID. But the question is then, okay, how do you actually do this on iOS, and how do you actually work with SKAN? And this is definitely where the mess comes in, yeah.
Yeah, and speaking about SKAdNetwork, can you tell us a little bit about this, how it actually works?
Sure. When it comes to SKAN, you first want to look at the reasons why Apple introduced the framework in the first place, and there's numerous reasons that are floating around in the industry. But if you look at the official communication and what you read in all documentation, it is about user privacy. That is Apple not wanting, or users not wanting, to be able to be identified or actually being linked back to their device ID or their any personal identifiable information for targeting and for measurement purposes. Now, what Apple then did is say, hey, in case a user actually does not give consent, you then default to actually the SKAdNetwork framework, which means we're going to give you a set amount of signals that you can then use to do your optimizations, but they're much more limited than you used to receive when you still could measure based on the IDFAs, in the old days, so to say. Now, it implied two things. One, you had to then work with a conversion schema. You had to choose one that would suit your app or suits your app best, which can be anything, for example, for a revenue schema or a funnel schema, depending a little bit on what kind of app you have. If you have a game, it makes sense to look at in-app purchases, revenue. If it's a funnel conversion, for example, with subscriptions, then it's a completely different type of source. And then you would receive encoded events that you would have to decode to then make sense of in your reporting. But also crucially, some of the data would be censored by Apple. So you would only receive about 80% of the postbacks or the events that you would want to have to do your optimizations, which means that a further 20% is pretty much dark figure or something that you would need to come up with yourself, or that's something that you need to model. So what you would have is a couple of problems. One, you would have not the same kind of data granularity. Two, you would actually have underreported data. And three, you could then not actually do your correct optimizations, even like in the kind of more limited framework as you would be optimizing on a campaign level, which kind of translates into the mess that you just described, like that a lot of developers have been facing with for the past while.
Still, if I understand correctly, a developer can invoke this ATT prompt, and if a user selects that he actually allows to be tracked, in this case, attribution solution can get very accurate data. Is this correct?
Absolutely. Like if the user allows this, and we continue to use the IDFA, there's actually no problem. The smooth sailing is pretty much like as before. The problem is like the other like 75%, right? And it's like when the ATT framework kicks in, and this is where you actually need to update your marketing stack, or like if you like use your own tools or like have your own mechanisms, you just have to like redesign the way that you do your work.
Apple recently released the updated SKAdNetwork version 4. What are the new features of this updated version?
So I think to understand a little bit like what's going on like in the market, and also like why Apple has released 4.0. I want to say there was like a massive backlash like in the industry, but like there's been a lot of like complaining about the level of the lack of data granularity. One, we saw a decrease in amount of marketing spend on iOS. We saw an increase on Android. So long and short of it is that like fewer traffic or fewer paid traffic was being diverted to the App Store, which also means like this is biting into Apple's revenue itself as well. Now that is one given. I think the second given is like if you listen to like the marketing professionals, they made it very clear that like their jobs were becoming like very frustrating because of the lack of granularity itself. Now, Apple sort of listened to that and made some updates. And in a nutshell, it is about adding like more granularity. So you would have, for example, more and different types of postbacks. So you still have like your one kind of find event that you could optimize towards, for something that you could choose. Your revenue or your funnel event, whatever that might not be. And you would have two additional events, and we can call those, they've got like three types of possible outcome, call them course events. They could be anything from, hey, like this is like a good user, a medium or mediocre user, or it's like a bad user, or like a subsequent event correlated to it. There are more updates in terms of granularity as well. I can send like a blog post that really goes into detail about like what those are. But that is in a nutshell really what it boils down to.
I just wanted to ask, is there still this time limit? I think there is 24 or 48 hours time limit where you can attribute some data to the install. And then, for example, you have a trial subscription and app that monetizes with trial subscription, and the trial is 3 days or 7 days. It's actually impossible to actually send the conversion data to the attribution platform. Is it still the case?
Well, I think there's always been ways to circumvent that. Well, not circumvent, but like by the way that you set up your postbacks. But yeah, the postback windows have been expanded as well. So that is definitely like a welcome update.
So it was extended, and what's the time limit now?
I'm not sure like if I have the details on there. I would need to get back to you on that.
Sure, no problem. We can add the link into the notes to this podcast. How to set up the attribution with Singular? If mobile app has just launched, how complex is the setup?
Yeah, with Singular, like it's a different situation, and like we develop tools that are really out of the box. So there's nothing that you actually need to do as a developer yourself to be able to work with Scan. Like if that is like the topic that like we're discussing today. So you can choose from about 7 conversion schemas. You can then work with our customer success team and the support team in identifying, hey, which one is the best one for you. But even more so, like we have updated our tools to not only include the signals that you are receiving from Apple, that you're receiving from Scan. So you would actually have a report in which you say on the left side here, like, are your Scan signals? This is your kind of like basic layer. But we also expanded that with something we call like Scan Advanced Analytics. And that is where we model the missing conversions that you may have. We do it with about a 90% accuracy rate. And the reason why it's important is because it allows you to actually go into like cohorted ROI. You can see your day 7 ROI, for example, but you can also then like much more accurately see and predict how your campaigns are performing or will be performing in the future. So it's an out-of-the-box solution. No additional knowledge is needed, and it really like goes back to the way that you used to be managing your campaigns, as if you were to be doing it on the IDFA basis.
And what does the reporting look like on Singular? What data can an app developer expect to see in Singular dashboards?
Yeah, so when it comes to like, your look at Android, for example, right? If we have the Google Advertising ID, then the amount of or the level of granularity that we have is completely different. And it's also unparalleled. And here, like, what really becomes interesting is that we started out as a marketing analytics company. So when we started about 8 years ago, our founder said, hey, like the problem that we're looking to solve is that we're spending money with a variety of platforms, but we want to have an overview of, hey, like, where have we been spending in a particular month? Say, for example, there's Facebook or Snap, TikTok or Google, whoever that might not be. But I also want to quickly be able to see that on the country level. Like if I'm spending in multiple countries, show my performance in France. I want to see it like on the creative level, or maybe like on the type of creative. Is it a video creative, or is it a keyword, or is it a banner, right? So that is a level of granularity that we actually offer. It goes quite deep, but also we can allow users to play around with that. So we have a product called Pivot. It works the same as a pivot table in Excel, where you say, hey, like let me first see my overall budget on the app level. Say your app is Candy Crush on iOS. You can see, hey, how much have I been spending on the country level? Then within the country, I want to see that like on the network level, or I want to turn it around, like on the network level and then in the country level, or like on the keyword level, etc., etc., etc. It is a level of granularity that we as an MMP and analytics partner offer, which is unparalleled. And it's really very helpful. Like if you have someone that wants an immediate answer, for example, someone in a creative team, how are my new stats of creatives performing across all of your platforms?
Okay, so what's the situation with Android? You mentioned that attribution there and the data granularity is much better than on iOS, but as I know, there will be some changes to Android as well, and in a sense, Google is just following what Apple already did, so we can expect more difficulties in attribution with Android store as well. What's the situation there?
So the situation is like there's no like immediate like disruption, same way that like there was a disruption with ATT. Google will be rolling out Google Privacy Sandbox, which if you look at like, what is the reasoning behind Privacy Sandbox, is very similar, like identical even to like, what Apple communication was. It is enabling marketers to continue to operate their growth operations, but in a user privacy safe environment, which also means that they will be deprecating the Google Advertising ID. There's a lot of things that we already know about Google Privacy Sandbox, and there's like definitely like some learnings I think that Apple took from the ATT rollout. Mm-hmm. First and foremost is the way that Google has been working with the industry itself to identify, hey, what is important not only for developers but also what's important for their partners, like their networks, and like also like players like Singular. And secondly, like the amount of documentation, how is the rollout going to be looking like? What kind of level of granularity is going to be available is different. What we see, for example, creative granularity that is going to be available at Google Privacy Sandbox, which is great because that is like one of the prime reasons why users would use Singular, for example, as their MMP. But you're also looking at a window of rollout, I think, in 2024. So there is right now nothing that marketers need to do apart from actually doing their homework, right? And getting ready. And I would go as far as saying like, hey, like, the reality is definitely like becoming more user privacy focused. So bearing that in mind and knowing that the two largest players in the market, Apple and Google, are changing the way you do your work. That should definitely be reason enough to at least do your reading right now.
Got it. And maybe you have some benchmarks or channel recommendations for Android apps in this case?
Well, in terms of like benchmark or like recommendations, you mean the kind of partners that they should be working with, or UA channels? Like what?
Yeah, UA channels. I think it's super interesting for our audience to know what currently works best for user acquisition in terms of channels specifically. What's trending now?
We publish the ROI index that's saying like every year, and we're going to be publishing it as well in I believe February next year. Mm-hmm. And there you really see like who are the main partners on the OS level that you should be working with. Now, unsurprisingly, like on iOS, like the rising star is definitely Apple search ads, and we'll probably see it as well in terms of how they will be ranking in February 2023. But yeah, we also saw TikTok increasing its market share and further increasing its market share in 2022. And we saw like on the big platforms, in particular Meta, like a slowdown in activity. Now, usually when developers come to us, and these can be like anything from like brands that have an app or app-first businesses, we would say to them, it's like, look, there is probably, if you want to start doing user acquisitions, anywhere between 1 and 20 partners that you can be starting with to run your app business, which is besides like the big, the Google and the Metas of this world, are companies like an Orange Source, a TikTok, Liftoff, Unity. They're the kind of companies that have been around for some time, but it's definitely like in the kind of like rankings between say 10 and 20, definitely up and coming partners. What we see is on the UA side, it is one thing to obtain the user or acquire the user, but there's another part of re-engagement and retention. And what we saw with the rollout of ATT is if your user acquisition costs do tend to increase, then it's even the more important to try and retain like the most valuable users that you have. And this will also like be the case with Google moving forward. So we're not really looking merely at UA, but we're looking at that whole cycle of acquiring and retaining and re-engaging a user. And I believe that in 2023, on the re-engagement and the retention side of things, there's probably going to be companies that are going to be increasing, the share of their budget pie as well.
Got it. So you see more focus on retaining users actually now than acquiring new
Absolutely.
users.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Listen, Niels, so thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. Maybe anything you personally would like to add, to share?
Yeah, I think from my side, it's like I joined Singular about like more than a year ago now. Like I come from the platform side actually, and one of the reasons why I moved from the platform side to the SaaS or the MMP side is because I was really intrigued by that shift that we were witnessing or still are witnessing in our industry, which is very, very pivotal. If you look at the way that we operate our businesses, the way that we can grow apps, but also the way that like business is going to be conducted. Say in 2024, where Google Privacy Sandbox has been reaching out, like the whole, the industry has been really like, shaken in that regard. And I would really argue that, especially in the case from Google, there are resources available. There's a lot of homework that people can do in terms of like getting ready. If you look at Scan 4.0 right now, it's also a perfect time to like really like analyze, hey, like how is my tech stack right now? for me to be able to take maximum advantage of like those improvements that Apple has been making. Because the fact of the matter is, you can't actually tap into those opportunities right now, because like first all of the SDKs need to be updated. That is going to be taking time as well. So like we'll probably see only the first results of this like rollout improvement maybe in 6 to 12 months from now. But that means now is the time that you start to work on updating tech stack or ask questions about like how can I use this to my advantage. And that is my key takeout. Like there are movements in our industry, a setback. It created hurdles to operate your business that have definitely been causing a lot of headache. But we do see welcome improvements. We also see the rise of like other networks that kind of tap into like opportunities that like have kind of come up to the back of it. And I think 2023 is simply going to be a very intriguing a year full of opportunities for everyone.
But by the way, you mentioned you came from platform basically. Is it Apple or Google? What platform are you referring to?
No, I was working at AdColony for 5 years.
AdColony.
And before that, I was in London, working at companies like Criteo, and right before I joined Singer, I was at Ep.8 in Hamburg, which is like a rewarded ad solution that also engages users continuously. Yeah, so I was doing ad sales, so like a lot of people in the industry know that. And now I'm working with exactly those partners and platforms to make sure that they understand, our value proposition as well, and also to talk about topics like user privacy. Like me as a user, like it's something that is I wouldn't say close to my heart, but like I find it just very interesting to talk about.
Do you think it's beneficial, this changes in privacy happen? Personally, myself, I don't think like Apple or advertisers were actually trying to track me. The whole thing of this IDFA is just to provide you with accurate ads, and I don't mind this at all. So anytime I see this prompt, I always allow to track me. So I will see like more custom experience, relevant ads, and stuff like that.
I also think that there's a discussion to be had there. It's about like how do you explain to your users what the benefit is of you actually like being tracked, and like the communication language should definitely not be so we actually show you relevant ads, because actually users don't really care, I think, in my opinion, like what ads like they're being shown. I think there's more like a sort of like unknown, and maybe like people get scared if they think that what are these app platforms actually doing with my data. And the fact of the matter is that like some platforms are making shitload of money with it. In exchange, providing you with like, free software, like, look at Facebook, it's a prime example. But I think the way that the IDFA was being used and the amount of data that we were aggregating and then like reselling, that is something that has, really shifted before ATT, a whole industry, and like where dollars are being spent, and like what power or like what kind of market share particular players were having. I think all of that was not necessarily why these changes or like Apple introduced ATT, but it's simply a level playing field shakeup. Explicitly, Apple does allow for you to use your first party data if you obtain it. So you can, if you want, incite or like encourage users to opt in, right? There's nothing wrong with that by simply explaining them, what you're using their data for. But that is a choice that developers make. And the reality is that like 75% of users do not want to have you use your IDFA for like whatever reason, right? And that is what you need to be working with and what the reality is.
Yeah, maybe that's exactly why, because people do not understand it. It kind of sounds scary that some random app will be tracking you. And if given a choice, of course, you choose not to be tracked because you don't know how the data is used. If you have better understanding of how the data is used, then the opt-in rate might be higher. And actually, this is what we recommend to some of our clients, like to explain why they're asking for this permission.
There was I think there's one experiment about a year ago that I read about, which was when you go like to a public space and you accept the terms and conditions for Wi-Fi,
Yeah.
no one actually reads them, right? Like you just want to get online and like, start scrolling away on Instagram, waste your time on social media. But there was one that said like, hey, like, if you accept the terms and conditions, that you give up your children for adoption. And that to me, it kind of indicate like, how little people actually care, like generally speaking, about data. But if you ask people if they care, of course they're going to say yes, right?
Yeah.
So here we go. That's my thought for Friday. Don't give up your kids for adoption for free Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I agree. So how our listeners can find you online? Can they follow you on Twitter, on LinkedIn? What's the best way to connect?
I am on LinkedIn, Niels Beenen, my name. You can find me there. If not, you can send me an email, niels.beenen@singular.net, and I'll go back to you.
Got it. Thanks so much, Neil. Thanks so much for doing this podcast. And have a great day.
Michael.
Thank you.